Contact at Gate 3, confirm trajectory. Rook Hale's command slammed across the underground chamber with the weight of a hammer blow. The men at their posts jolted to attention, fingers racing across worn consoles as the heads-up displays erupted with jagged traces. A high-pitched alarm shrieked until one of the operators struck the reset panel with his palm. The stale air carried the sharp sting of overheated wiring, and the glow from the laser plasma display painted every anxious face in the room a blood-red hue. Hale leaned forward over the plotting table, his jaw tight as he watched the alien signatures crawl across the display. They moved with deliberate weight, not like scouts testing defenses, but like predators settling into their kill. His heartbeat thudded in his ears, steady as the measured cadence of boots on stone floors. 3 hulls, Talon Reese said, voice clipped, his eyes darting between figures. He looked far older than his years, fatigue etched into his posture. Their mass reads heavy, not raiders. We're staring at full war platforms. His hands trembled as he adjusted the calibration dials, the faint scrape of metal against metal echoing through the command space. Hale's gaze cut toward him, not with judgment, but with the unspoken weight of expectation. Reese swallowed hard and pressed his teeth together, pushing through calculations that the aging system lagged behind on. He knew Hale needed numbers now, not later. Boots thundered against the stairwell as Ivo Mar barged through, chest heaving, the scent of grease and burned lubricant clinging to him like a shadow. His harness clattered with tools as he unbuckled it in haste, eyes scanning the crimson display. "We gutted the tugs," he announced, wiping his brow with a sleeve streaked in soot. "We can mount drivers on 3 frames, maybe 4 if we rip out oxygen lines. Don't expect a second run once they're fired. We're running them bare." His tone carried frustration, but beneath it lay determination. Hale met his stare without flinching. Both men knew what it meant. Those skiffs were coffins once they lit their engines. "They'll throw rocks first," Hale said evenly, pointing toward the colony markers at the rim of the display. "They don't need to bombard us into ash. They'll fracture morale with a single drop." He raised his voice, steady but sharp, so that even the furthest operator snapped his head up. "Get civilians into the basalt tunnels. They'll survive shock waves, and the enemy won't waste ordnance tearing through stone when fear costs them nothing." Orders rippled outward. Boots struck the floor in unison. Shouts echoed down reinforced corridors, and the clatter of gear straps carried like drum beats into the distance. The colony was moving, responding, pulling itself inward under his command. A vibration crawled through the bunker walls, followed by a dull roar that set teeth on edge. Dust shook loose from overhead ducts, powdering the consoles until men coughed and rubbed grit from their eyes. One monitor snapped black with a hiss of smoke. A technician cursed and yanked down the breaker lever, sparks biting his gloves. The taste of burnt insulation spread across tongues, acrid enough to sting throats raw. Hale ignored the sting in his lungs and raised his voice above the coughs. "Mark that impact. They've given warning. Next volley won't miss." He saw the fear in the whites of the younger men's eyes, and he let them see that his hands did not shake. On the far bench, Dane Core hunched over improvised consoles, crusted with dust from hours spent in the geology shafts. His instruments, meant to probe bedrock density, had been hijacked into the sensor net, their makeshift readings feeding orbital data. "Seismic reflections confirm entries," Core called, his tone steady like a miner reading fault lines. "They'll lock the gates inside the hour. Once their screen is up, we're sealed in." He rubbed his hands together, grit crunching between his fingers, then returned to typing, pushing dust-caked buttons as though tunneling through rock with words instead of drills. Hale crossed to him, ignoring the protest of torn muscles where shrapnel had scored his side days earlier. Pain flared beneath the sealant foam, but his stride never faltered. "We hold them here," he said, low enough for only the nearest officers to hear. "Every minute they waste is another chance Fleet reads our signal. Evo, your men prep those tugs. Reese, set coil guns for intercept arcs. Dane, keep those orbital readings alive even if you burn the circuits down to ash." His commands were absorbed instantly, each officer drawing purpose from the clarity in his words. They understood the stakes without illusions. Fleet aid might never come. But Hale's orders left no space for despair. The rumble of evacuation echoed from above as sirens guided families into the tunnels. The sound of small feet stumbling down spiral ramps carried through the ventilation shafts. Wails of children blended with the hollow clang of miners dragging supply crates, echoing faintly into the chamber, like a distant reminder of the cost of failure. Hale set his palm against the cold railing, grounding himself, picturing those faces pressed against the basalt walls, eyes wide in the darkness, waiting for news they might never receive. He exhaled through gritted teeth and turned back to the display, where the enemy's crimson markers tightened their grip on the colony's orbit. "Enemy drones deploying," one of the operators shouted, voice strained by panic. The plasma display, lit with a spray of hostile pickets, scattered into a net that would soon close around every escape corridor. The image glowed against sweating foreheads and pale skin, bathing them all in the color of blood. Hale's hands curled against the table. He studied the red swarm, his face set like carved stone. Around him, men labored furiously, Reese whispering numbers as he shaped intercept paths. Mar gritting his teeth as he scribbled repair notes for tugs already stripped to bones. Core leaning closer to a flickering screen as if he could drag signals through stone by will alone. Every sound, from clicking keys to the scrape of boots, blended into a rhythm of survival. And above it all, Hale's eyes stayed locked on the enemy, his expression unreadable, but his intent unmistakable. If they wanted this colony broken, they would bleed for it. "Light those furnaces. I want the drivers mounted before they tighten that net." Hale's voice rolled across the tug yard like a crack of thunder. Sparks showered from cutting torches as crews carved through bulkheads, tearing the old mining frames down to bare spines. The cavernous bay thundered with the clang of steel on steel, the bite of drills and the rumble of cranes hauling stripped modules aside. Heat blasted upward from the furnaces, baking sweat onto men's brows until salt stung their eyes. The air reeked of burnt lubricant and scorched paint, every breath laced with the grit of ground-down metal. Hale strode through it all, his boots striking the grated floor in an unbroken cadence, his gaze cutting from one station to the next. Ivo Mar stood over one of the skeletal tugs, his harness rattling with tools as he barked instructions to the welders perched on the stripped frame. "Weld that mount flush. Don't leave gaps. If the rod vibrates loose, the recoil will tear the ship in half." He pulled a rag across his soot-stained face, eyes blazing with an intensity born of desperation. Spotting Hale, he climbed down and wiped his hands on his trousers. "3 are near ready. The 4th is a gamble. If we strip out life support, we can mount a driver, but the frame won't take more than one burn." Hale studied the half-built skiff. The driver scavenged from an abandoned coil gun mount, jutted from the stripped nose like a spear, raw welds still glowing faint orange. The cockpit was nothing more than a reinforced chair bolted to the frame, surrounded by cables and shielding plates. "You'll have to fly them manually," Hale said, his tone steady, though his eyes betrayed the weight of the decision. "Autopilot won't last against swarm jamming." Mar's lips tightened. "You're asking men to sit in coffins. They won't come back." His words were blunt, stripped of embellishment, the way miners spoke when lives hung in balance. "They know," Hale replied. His gaze swept across the crews, men hammering brackets, soldering leads, dragging fuel hoses across the deck, each pair of shoulders bent with the same grim purpose. "They've been waiting for this since the first alarm." He turned back to Mar. "Give them something worth the cost." Above them, a siren wailed once, then cut short as power was diverted again. The sudden silence left the hiss of welders and the scrape of boots as the only sound, like the strained breathing of the colony itself. Mar nodded once, jaw clenched, then returned to his men, snapping orders as though his voice alone could hold the frame together. On the far side of the yard, Reese bent over a cluster of consoles, coil gun schematics glowing across the heads-up displays. He tapped trajectories into the system, sweat dripping onto the keys as he muttered numbers under his breath. Hale approached, and Reese glanced up, his eyes hollow from sleepless hours. "I've set intercept arcs for low orbit," he explained. "The guns can't track drones this fast, but if we seed debris at the right angles, we can choke their vectors. Buy us minutes, maybe more." His voice shook, not from fear but from exhaustion. "Minutes will do," Hale answered. He laid a hand briefly on Reese's shoulder, grounding the younger man before moving on. Each of them needed to know their efforts mattered, even if the outcome was uncertain. Dane Core entered from the tunnel access, his uniform smeared with dust, his face streaked where he had wiped sweat with dirty hands. He carried a portable sensor unit salvaged from the geology lab, its screen flickering with unstable readings. "They've started shifting rocks toward us," Core reported, his breath heavy. "Trajectory suggests they'll drop small ones first, test our responses before committing." He set the unit on a workbench, the beeping of its alarms cutting through the hammering around them. "We need decoys in orbit before they commit their payloads, or the settlements are finished." Hale circled the bench, studying the uneven traces on the display. His jaw tightened. "Then we'll throw them ghosts." He turned to Mar across the bay. "Strip out every fuel tank you can find, fill them with slag, and put them on timed burns. I want the sky filled with shadows they can't ignore." Mar looked up from the skiff, his face grim. "They'll see through it eventually. They only need to believe long enough for us to survive the next wave," Hale said. His words echoed through the cavern, swallowed by the roar of furnaces and the crackle of torches. Hours bled together in the tug yard. Sparks rained from overhead rails where welders balanced on girders, their mass reflecting molten light. The floor shuddered with each impact from distant strikes, dust trickling from overhead pipes into sweating eyes. The heat pressed in, suffocating, the air thick with the taste of iron and ash. Hale moved from station to station, a steady presence amid the chaos, his voice never rising in panic, only in command. When the first skiff rolled out, its hull stripped to bare ribs, a coil gun driver protruding like a lance, the men paused to watch. They stood with grease-stained hands resting on knees, their faces streaked and hollow, but their eyes locked on the fragile craft as though it were a weapon forged from their own bones. Mar climbed into the cockpit, testing the controls. The frame creaked under the shift of weight, cables straining against bolts, but the driver held. He looked down at Hale, his expression unreadable. "Will it hold?" Hale asked. Mar flexed the controls, listening to the whine of servos, the vibration of unbalanced mounts. "For one run," he said. Then he added more quietly, "That's all it needs." Hale nodded once. "Then that's enough." The bay doors rumbled open, a gust of cold air sweeping in from the outside tunnels. Men shivered as the temperature dropped, the smell of damp stone pushing aside the stench of burning grease. The skiff was hauled toward the exit ramp, its shadow stretching across the floor under the glare of industrial lights. Outside, the sky shimmered with distant fire as enemy drones swept through upper orbits, their movements recorded as angry red arcs across the plasma displays. "First volley coming," Reese called from the console bank, his voice strained. "Impact in 30 minutes. Trajectories point toward the east sector." Hale's chest tightened. The east sector shelters were filled with miners' families. He raised his voice so every man in the yard could hear. "Get those decoys in the sky now. Make them doubt every rock they throw." His words reverberated against steel and stone, answered by the roar of engines and the grind of treads as the first skiffs rolled into the launch tunnels. As the crews scrambled, Hale stood in the middle of the yard, his face set against the weight of what was coming. His men moved around him, shouts mixing with the clang of tools and the hiss of welders. The air stank of fuel and stone dust. The heat pressed like a hand on every back, and the roar of approaching war thundered in the distance. Hale breathed in the choking air, tasted grit on his tongue, and set his jaw. Whatever came next, they would not meet it on their knees. "Impact confirmed." East sector shelters rattled but still sealed. Reese's shout cut through the roar of the command chamber as the deck quivered under their boots. Dust sifted from overhead vents, coating consoles in a thin film. Hale braced himself against the rail, his injured side flaring as the vibration pressed against torn muscle. He gritted his teeth but kept his voice steady, locking eyes with the officers hunched over their displays. "Mark every strike. If they test our defenses, I want to know how they measure our silence." His words were calm, yet each syllable carried iron. The laser plasma display seared crimson shapes across the room, outlining enemy vectors now plunging deeper into orbit. The drones that had formed a net earlier thickened into a choking cloud. They moved in disciplined arcs, pinching the colony into an invisible cage. Mar wiped his soot-caked face, leaning over Hale's shoulder. They're closing gaps faster than we can seed them. If they finish that ring, the skiffs won't break through. His breath carried the sourness of fatigue, the kind that came from hours of recycled air, and nothing but ration bars on his stomach. They mean to suffocate us, Hale muttered, eyes fixed on the tightening lines. Not destroy, not yet. They'll squeeze until hope collapses. He straightened, his hand leaving a smear of grit on the rail. Then we bleed them for every inch they try to close. The next strike landed before he finished speaking. The floor heaved as though a giant had slammed its fist into the earth. Men toppled from their chairs. One console toppled over with a crash, sparks spraying as wires tore loose. The tang of scorched insulation filled the chamber, making throats burn. Technicians coughed, dragging the console upright, their faces pale in the red wash of displays. Hale hauled one man back to his seat, gripping his arm tight. You hold until I say otherwise, he barked. The colony doesn't run without your hands on those keys. The man nodded, trembling, but anchored by the force in Hale's command. Core rushed in from the geology tunnel, clutching his portable sensor unit against his chest. Sweat darkened his collar, his hair matted with dust. They're shifting their vectors, he reported between gasps. Not dropping rocks anymore. Scans suggest directed sweeps. They're frying the surface with radiation bursts, taking out our comm towers piece by piece. He set the unit on the bench, the readouts flashing in erratic pulses. We're going blind up there. Hale's expression hardened. Then we fight blind. Feed what you can through the underground lines. Shielded fiber might still carry enough for targeting. He raised his voice to the room. Get every surviving coil gun tied into those channels. We'll run our war through stone if we have to. Mar slammed his fist against the console, grease smearing across the screen. We're losing men every time we light a skiff. Drones are swarming them before they reach altitude. His words came with raw anger, the sound of someone bearing comrades in his head while still fighting. You think I don't see that? Hale snapped back, his voice sharp enough to silence the chamber. He took a breath, forcing the heat down before it burned discipline away. Every loss buys us time. Without those runs, the shelters would already be craters. His eyes met Mar's, not with fury but with heavy truth. Tell your crews their sacrifice holds the colony together. That's not a wasted death. Mar clenched his jaw, then nodded once, understanding the weight but refusing to soften his glare. The chamber shook again, this time longer. Lights flickered, bathing faces and alternating shadows in red glow. Hale staggered against the rail, pain ripping across his side where the old wound tore anew. He hissed but forced himself upright. A medic tried to press a patch into his hands, but Hale pushed it away. Later, I stay on my feet while the colony stands. His voice cracked at the edge, but no one doubted his resolve. Above, through thick concrete and stone, the groaning of the colony's surface infrastructure carried faintly into the bunker. It sounded like a city being bent under unseen hands, cables snapping, towers collapsing in distant cascades. The men glanced upward, hearing in that groan the slow unraveling of everything they had built. Reese slammed his palm against the table. We can't outlast them this way. They'll strip us to silence. His voice wavered, not out of cowardice but out of grim arithmetic. Hale walked to him, each step deliberate, boots scraping grit across the floor. We don't outlast them, he said firmly. We outthink them. He pointed at the red arcs tightening on the display. They believe their doctrine is enough. They've never fought miners with nothing left to lose. He lowered his voice, but everyone in the chamber leaned closer. Our advantage is chaos. We make them chase shadows until they break formation. Another impact rattled the chamber, forcing men to grip rails to stay upright. The vibration set teeth on edge, rattled helmets against steel lockers, made the air hum like a struck drumhead. Smoke from fried circuitry hung low, the acrid flavor coating tongues until throats rasped. Hale coughed once, then straightened, his voice cutting through the haze. Get ready. They're not finished. Neither are we. Mars comms unit buzzed. He pressed it to his ear, listening. then turned back with eyes burning. One of the skiffs got through. Not far, but it scattered debris across their path. Drones pulled off to intercept. It bought us breathing room. Relief flickered briefly across faces before the weight of the next moment settled back in. "Mark that on the record," Hale ordered. "Every small victory teaches us how they react." He looked across the chamber, his gaze settling on each man in turn. "We hold because we learn. And when the chance comes, we'll turn that learning into their mistake." His words landed like anchors, pulling the men's fear down into something solid. The ground shook again, not from a strike, but from the colony's own coil guns firing in sequence. The thunder rolled through stone corridors, shaking dust from every surface. Men covered their ears against the concussion, but in those bursts was a reminder. They were still in the fight. The sound of their own guns was rough, uneven, but alive. Hale closed his eyes briefly, hearing in that thunder the heartbeat of a colony refusing to collapse. When he opened them, he caught Mar watching him. The two men exchanged a single nod. Whatever came next, they would carve survival out of the enemy's grip with their bare hands if they had to. "Reading something strange in the geology lab feed," Kor's voice rang out, sharp and urgent, cutting across the bunker just as the echoes of the colony's coil gun barrage faded. Through the stone walls, men jerked their heads toward him, startled, their hands still braced against consoles rattling from the recoil below. Kor was hunched over a battered sensor unit balanced on a crate, its screen glowing faint green. His fingers traced the shaky lines with almost feverish intensity, his eyes wide behind grime-streaked lids. Hale moved fast, ignoring the twinge in his ribs as he crossed the room. He pressed a hand on Kor's shoulder, leaning close enough to see the uneven spikes moving across the display. The taste of dust hung thick in his mouth as he spoke in a low growl. "What are we looking at?" Kor swallowed, voice hoarse. "Not orbital debris. These are neutrino pulses, regular, patterned. At first I thought interference, but the rhythm repeats. It's a signal." He tapped the edge of the screen, his nails leaving pale streaks in the dust coating the casing. "Somebody's talking out there." Reese turned from the weapons console, his face flushed from heat and strain. "The enemy doesn't use neutrinos. Too heavy for their doctrine. Could it be fleet?" His question carried a dangerous hope that made the room fall silent. Every man stared at Kor as though the weight of survival rested on his confirmation. Kor's jaw worked as he fought for control. "I can't trace it exactly. Our rig was built for rock density scans, not interstellar comms. But the pulses align with fleet protocols I studied during academy training. There's no mistaking it. Somebody is coming." The bunker erupted with voices. Operators clapped backs. Some even laughed nervously, the sound brittle in the heavy air. Mar shoved through the crowd, his face lined with both relief and suspicion. "How far?" he demanded. "If it's fleet, when?" His fists were still black with grease, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes burned for an answer. Kor hesitated, glancing at Hale before answering. "Days. Maybe more. Depends on how close they were when they picked us up. They're pushing hard, but not here yet." The room's brief joy dimmed into uneasy silence. Mar swore under his breath, slamming his palm against the bulkhead so hard flakes of rust showered down. "We can't last days at this rate. We're bleeding ships, men, and morale every hour." He turned to Hale, eyes wild. "If we sit waiting, we're dead before fleet crosses the line." Hale let the words hang before speaking, his tone firm and measured, forcing calm into the room. "Waiting isn't an option. We shape the fight until they arrive. The signal means one thing. We're not alone. That gives us obligation, not relief." He looked around at every face. "We hold the line so they have ground to land on." Reese exhaled sharply, gripping the console rail until his knuckles blanched. "Then we need something new. The drones adapt faster each run. Our tricks won't hold long enough." Hale straightened, ignoring the throbbing. Fire in his side. His eyes flicked to the plasma display. The enemy fleet still circling like wolves around wounded prey. "Then we change the game. They trust order. We give them chaos." He turned to Kor. "You caught that signal with a geology scanner. Keep pulling it in. Refine it if you can. I want timing, trajectory, and confirmation the instant it strengthens. If our allies reach us, we need to meet them with more than broken tugs and rubble. Kor nodded, already adjusting dials, sweat dripping into his collar as he leaned closer to the unit. I'll keep it alive, whatever it takes. Mars stepped forward, his voice harsh but steady now. Then tell us what chaos looks like, Hale. My crews need orders before they collapse. Hale's gaze locked on him, then moved across the men in the bunker. Their faces were smeared with dirt, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but they watched him with the expectancy of miners waiting for the foreman's verdict before a dangerous shift. He knew the colony's survival rested not on the promise of distant rescue, but on whether he could make these men believe the impossible could be bent into reality. He lifted his hand, pointing toward the map where the red arcs of enemy drones shifted relentlessly. We're going to howl, not with voices, but with fire, slag, and shadows. We'll make them see an army where there is none. His words rolled through the chamber, slow and deliberate, igniting something in the weary eyes before him. They expect neat vectors and controlled volleys. Instead, we'll fill the sky with ghosts. By the time fleet arrives, the enemy won't know where to point their guns. Silence fell, but it was not disbelief. It was the silence of men absorbing the weight of a gamble that might save them or bury them. Mars' lips twisted into a grim smile, the first flicker of light Hale had seen in him since the siege began. Then let's build our ghosts, he said, his voice rough but alive. The chamber stirred with motion. Operators bent back over consoles, calling out numbers as they adjusted targeting paths. Technicians rushed to the tunnels to prepare new decoys, their boots ringing against steel ladders. The bunker smelled of sweat and scorched circuits. Yet for the first time in days, the air carried more than despair. It carried direction. Reese returned to his station, his voice steady now as he called out intercept vectors. If we time the burst through the slag clouds, we can create phantom signatures. Their scanners will think we're deploying reinforcements. He glanced at Hale with renewed determination. We can fake strength we don't have. Good, Hale answered. Then make it convincing. He gripped the rail once more, his knuckles white. The pain in his ribs gnawed deeper, but he forced it aside. The thought of aid burning through the void, days away, anchored him. They had to endure until it arrived. And if endurance alone would not hold, then deception, sacrifice, and calculated madness would. As the men worked, Kor called out again, his voice carrying from the corner where the scanner pulsed. Signal steadying. Whoever it is, they're still coming. He raised his head, sweat dripping from his chin. It's real. They're out there. Hale allowed himself the faintest nod, though he kept his face composed. Then we meet them halfway. He raised his voice to the room. Every decoy you launch, every skiff you burn, every coil gun you fire, it all adds to the howl. When they finally break orbit and come for us, they'll think hell itself is waiting. The men answered not with cheers but with renewed motion, each returning to his post with a grim sort of resolve. Tools clattered, commands echoed, circuits sparked, and the bunker came alive again. For the first time since the enemy descended, the colony was no longer only enduring. It was preparing to fight on its own terms. Get those slag tanks moving now! Hale's command thundered across the yard as if he could drag the colony back from the edge of ruin with volume alone. The cavern blazed with torchlight, welders perched on scaffolds as sparks cascaded around them like burning rain. The stench of scorched rubber and hot steel clung to every surface, mixing with the bitter tang of sweat that dripped from men working past exhaustion. The roar of cranes lifting stripped fuel tanks overhead made the walls shudder, dust showering onto the floor where technicians shouted over each other to keep the tempo alive. Ivo Mar vaulted onto a platform beside a gutted skiff, wiping grease with the back of his hand, his expression lit by the welding arc. We filled the first batch with slag. They'll burn like stars when ignited. Give me 4 more hours and we'll turn this place into an inferno. His voice carried both triumph and dread, for he knew the men pouring stone and waste metal into those frames understood they were building nothing meant to return. Hale climbed the ramp toward him, gripping the rail with his injured arm despite the fire racing along his ribs. He pushed through the ache, his eyes never leaving Mars. You have 2 hours, he replied, his tone hard as quarried rock. The enemy tightens their circle every minute. We launch on my mark. Ready or not, Mark clenched his jaw, then shouted down to his crews, "Double the pace! If you can't weld it straight, weld it fast." Sparks cascaded around him as men obeyed, their movements jerky but determined, sweat dripping into their eyes as they dragged hoses across the scorched floor. Across the chamber, Reese hunched over a console, his shoulders trembling with fatigue. The heads-up display flickered with hundreds of shifting arcs, his fingers hammering keys as he calculated firing windows. He didn't notice Hale approach until a hand settled firmly on his shoulder. "Talk to me," Hale ordered. Reese licked, cracked lips, eyes bloodshot from staring too long into the glow. "We seed the slag in staggered waves. Each burst of debris will scatter their targeting arrays. If we time the coil gun launches to align with the debris curtains, their drones will misread it as incoming reinforcements." His words spilled fast, each syllable rasping with exhaustion, but the spark in his voice told Hale he still believed. "Then make sure every number is sound," Hale said, his tone softer than before. "Men are flying into the teeth of that swarm on your math." Reese gave a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "It's more faith than math at this point, sir." He looked up, meeting Hale's gaze with a thin smile. "But if faith keeps them alive long enough, I'll take it." Dane Core entered then, carrying the portable scanner cradled against his chest. Its small display pulsed in measured rhythm, faint but steady. He set it on the table, its glow cutting through the haze of smoke. "Signals growing stronger. Whoever is coming hasn't turned back. They're burning toward us." His voice trembled with both awe and terror, as though the thought of salvation carried as much weight as the thought of annihilation. Mar leaned close to the display, eyes narrowing. "A single ship can't turn this tide." "Maybe not," Hale replied, his voice steady, "but it only needs to tip the balance. We hold until it arrives." He swept his gaze across all of them, the officers and workers staring back with faces streaked by grease, dust, and fear. "That's why we build the Howl. To make the enemy believe they're not facing one crippled colony, but an entire fleet bearing down on them." The room stilled as the words sank in. Then Mars smirked, a grim curve of his lips. "A howl. That's exactly what this will sound like when slag and fuel ignite together." Hours blurred into a rhythm of clangs and shouts. Crews hauled slag tanks into launch cradles, their boots pounding against the steel as the bay echoed with the strain of chains and the grind of gears. The heat pressed against their skin, soaking their uniforms until they stuck like second hides. Hale walked among them, speaking to each team, his voice steady, grounding men who fought not just machines, but exhaustion that clawed at their bones. One young technician staggered as a crate slipped, nearly crushing his hand. Hale caught his arm, steadying him. "Drink." Then back to it. The boy nodded, gulping water, eyes shining with something like gratitude. Hale released him, turning back to oversee the next stage. Even in war, a commander's word could give breath where none remained. When the first slag tank was hauled onto the ramp, its frame rattling against chains, Mar climbed beside it, inspecting every weld. He slammed the final pin into place and called down, "Ready to launch on your order." Hale raised his voice so the bay carried every syllable. "Listen to me. These aren't weapons in the old sense. They're echoes, shadows, ghosts. We're giving the enemy illusions so real they'll choke on them. Every one of you has built something that will change the course of this battle. Remember that when the sky lights up, the crew straightened, shoulders squaring, eyes lifting from the grime to meet his gaze. For a moment, the fatigue in the bay thinned. Then the alarm screamed again. Reese shouted from the console bank, "Drones shifting." They've sensed activity in the yard. They're moving to intercept his words, cut like a blade through the fragile stillness. "Then we launch," Hale ordered. He slammed his palm against the release lever. The ramp shuddered, chains clattered, and the first slag tank groaned forward, carried by the rumble of gears until it shot into the dark. The ground trembled with the force of its departure, the air filling with the taste of scorched stone dust shaken loose from the ceiling. The men in the bay held their breath, watching the console as Reese tracked its path. Seconds stretched long until the slag ignited, flaring like a dying star. The display erupted with false signatures scattering across the enemy's net. Reese shouted, "They're reacting!" Splitting vectors, diverting drones to intercept. A ragged cheer broke through the bay, men clapping each other's backs, voices hoarse but triumphant. Hale allowed himself a thin nod before raising his hand. "Don't stop now." More launches, more shadows. His voice rose above the chaos, carrying command like iron through fire. One after another, the slag tanks were hauled into the sky, igniting into blazing decoys that confused the enemy grid. On the plasma display, red arcs scrambled, breaking formation as they chased phantoms. Mars stood beside Hale, both of them watching the display, sweat running down their faces. "You've done it," Mar whispered, awe threading through his exhaustion. Hale didn't answer, his eyes locked on the shifting swarm. "Not yet. We've only opened the first door. The real fight comes when our allies arrive." The bay thundered with another launch, the ground beneath them shaking as the colony howled into the void. "Contact confirmed on long range. We've got a fleet transponder." Reese's voice cracked, louder than the rattle of gears, as another slag tank slid into launch position. The entire bay froze mid-motion. Welders lifting their visors, loaders halting with cables straining under the weight of slag-filled containers. Even Mar lowering the torch in his hand, as though the flame had lost purpose. The words sank into the room like a shockwave. Hale strode to the command platform, his boots striking the grated floor with a sharp rhythm. He leaned over the heads-up display Reese had pulled up, eyes narrowing at the faint flicker of a blue-green marker weaving through enemy red arcs. "How far?" he demanded, his voice carrying no room for hesitation. Reese tapped the screen with a trembling finger, sweat dripping from his brow. "Minutes out from the outer perimeter. They're running hot, straight into the corridor we opened." His chest rose and fell too fast, exhilaration mingling with terror. Mar threw down his torch, the clang echoing across the bay. "A single ship against 3 war hulls? They'll be slaughtered before they clear the ring." His words landed heavy, dragging men's hope back toward despair. Hale turned on him, his voice sharp as flint. "Then it's on us to open the gap wider. They didn't come here to save us. They came to finish what we started. We hold the path." He swept his gaze across the crews, faces streaked with soot and eyes red from exhaustion. "Every launch, every coil gun round, every trick we've built, it all converges here. If that ship breaks through, we have a chance. If it doesn't, we're ash." The bay roared back into motion. Men heaved on chains, torches screamed as steel was cut. Loaders shoved slag tanks into place. The air thickened with the taste of rust and sweat, and sparks bit into skin, but no one slowed. Mar barked orders, his voice hoarse, forcing his men to move as though momentum itself could push back fear. The floor shivered, not from their machinery this time, but from the distant thunder of the colony's coil guns. Reese shouted updates as he tracked vectors. "Drones are peeling off. They've seen the incoming contact." Splitting forces to intercept his words set a ripple through the room, the weight of possibility igniting tired eyes. Hale slammed his hand against the rail, the sound cracking through the din. "Launch everything! Fill the sky until they can't tell what's real and what's not." The ramp groaned, chains rattled, and another slag tank roared outward, the ground trembling beneath their feet as if the colony itself joined the fight. On the display, the detonation flared bright, scattering debris that tangled red arcs into chaos. Mars crews shouted as more tanks followed, each departure marked by the taste of grit falling from overhead beams and the smell of scorched paint where friction seared metal. Then Core's voice cut through, raw with disbelief. "Visual confirmation. I've got it through the upper scopes." He turned the monitor toward Hale. Grainy feed, distorted by interference, revealed the shape of a warship slashing through the black. Hull scarred, radiators flaring like wings of fire. "She's real. Resolute has arrived for a heartbeat." Silence pressed down. Men stared, the image burning into them. A promise forged from steel and defiance. Then the chamber erupted. Cheers, fists pounding against consoles, voices breaking from exhaustion into wild relief. Mar grabbed the rail, His face split with a grin that looked foreign after so much grimness. She's diving straight at them. Hale raised his hand, cutting through the uproar. His tone was quiet, but it carried more weight than the shouting. This isn't victory. Not yet. One ship doesn't win this fight. But with our ghosts in the sky and their guns behind us, we might just hold long enough to matter. The screen lit crimson again as enemy war hulls pivoted, their drones vectoring hard toward the intruder. Reese called out, his voice racing. They're diverting escorts. The corridor's thinning, but she won't survive unless we keep feeding false signatures. Hale pointed at the launch crews. Load faster. Mar, burn every tank you've got left. Reese, time the coil guns with their approach. Core, keep that signal alive. We need every scrap of data she sends. His commands snapped through the chamber like cables tightening on a pulley, dragging men into motion. Mar's men hauled another slag tank onto the ramp, their hands blistered, uniforms blackened with soot. One stumbled, nearly crushed as the chain slipped. Mar dove, dragging him clear, then shoved the load back into motion. His voice broke as he shouted, You drop dead later, lad. Right now you move. The young man staggered upright, coughing, and pushed with the others, determination carved into his face. Above, the ground shook again, not from their weapons this time, but from the enemy's retaliation. Dust sifted down like falling ash. Reese swore, wiping grit from his eyes. They're firing wide sweeps, trying to fry the launch bays. If they hit direct, we're finished. Hale seized the comm unit, his voice steel hard. Tell every crew, the howl doesn't stop. If they burn the bay, launch from rubble. If they cut power, ignite by hand. We hold until Resolute breaks through. The plasma display bloomed as Resolute opened fire. Rail slugs streaked across the void, grazing escorts and tearing drones into fragments that spun like sparks in a black forge. The image crackled, static washing over it, but the sound of men cheering drowned the noise. For the first time since the siege began, they saw not survival, but retaliation. Hale leaned on the rail, his injured side throbbing, sweat dripping from his brow. His voice dropped low, a promise only those closest heard. We're not alone anymore. The room swelled with another launch, chains rattling, slag roaring outward, the colony itself howling louder than before. And above on the display, Resolute carved its path deeper, each volley tearing the enemy's grip wider apart. The bay became a storm of fire, grit, and unyielding will. Men screamed orders, hauled chains, dragged their bodies beyond exhaustion. Hale stood at the center, unbroken, his voice anchoring them all as their howl joined with the guns of a battered warship diving headlong into the fight. Coil guns online, fire on my mark. Reese's shout rattled against the steel walls of the command chamber as the ground trembled under their boots. The thunder that followed was not enemy fire this time, but their own weapons roaring through the stone belly of the colony. The concussion rolled through every rib, leaving teeth vibrating and ears ringing. Dust spilled from the ceiling vents, coating consoles in gray powder, while the laser plasma display flared with fresh arcs, slugs tearing into space, carving their path through the drone net. Hale gripped the rail with both hands, ignoring the sharp pain gnawing at his side. His eyes fixed on the display where red and blue markers collided in violent bursts of light. Shift firing angles, he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. Seed the curtain before Resolute breaks through, or she won't live long enough to fire again. His tone was steady, but inside, every beat of his heart counted the seconds the warship had left. In the launch bay, Mars crews wrestled slag tanks onto the final cradles. Their arms quivered from exhaustion, sweat dripping from their brows into stinging eyes, uniforms blackened with soot. Mars' throat was raw from shouting, but he forced more words out, spurring the men forward. Push! Every second counts. The tanks groaned on their chains, the smell of scorched paint and burning grease choking the air as the ramps shuddered open. One crewman stumbled, his knees buckling as the load slipped. Mar lunged, grabbing the chain with both hands. The sudden weight nearly tore his shoulders apart, but he held long enough for two others to heave the tank back into place. His vision swam, the taste of iron filling his mouth as he bit his tongue. Yet he roared again, louder than before. Get it moving! The young man who had faltered nodded once, shame hardening into resolve, and pushed until his muscles screamed. Above, the colony shook as enemy fire slammed into the surface. The roar of collapsing structures filtered down through the rock, a sound like giants snapping bones overhead. The air ducts groaned with pressure, rattling bolts loose. Men flinched but did not stop. They had already buried too many to falter now. Kor's voice burst from the corner where his scanner pulsed. Resolute's closing the corridor. She's cutting through their flank. 20 seconds until firing arc. His hands flew across the console, sweat dripping into his eyes as he dragged in shaky signals through stone-thick interference. Hale seized the comm. Reese, align every coil gun you've got with that window. Mar, launch the last wave now. Launching! Mar bellowed. The ramp screamed as the final slag tank shot outward. The floor beneath them shook with such force that men staggered against rails and walls, coughing dust. The console flared as the decoy burst into fragments, scattering burning debris across the void. On the display, enemy drones shifted frantically, their formations twisting into knots as they chased phantoms. Window clear, Reese shouted. His hand slammed the firing command, and the colony's coil guns spat another barrage, rods streaking upward through the chaos of debris. The arcs converged exactly where Resolute dove. On the display, the warship erupted into motion. Her rail batteries fired in savage rhythm, slugs tearing across escort's radiators, sparks blooming like fireworks against the black. Men in the chamber erupted in shouts, voices breaking with awe and desperation. Mar leaned on the rail, his chest heaving, eyes wide as the warship's silhouette burned brighter with each volley. She's inside the corridor! The enemy answered at once. Red arcs on the display swung toward the colony, targeting the tunnels where civilians sheltered. A missile wave, massive enough to obliterate the basalt caverns, streaked downward. Kor's face drained of color. They're aiming for the shelters. If it hits... Hale didn't let him finish. He turned to Mar, his voice raw but steady. We have one skiff left. Mar froze, then nodded slowly, understanding before the words were even spoken. He pressed his comm, his jaw set. Remote pilots ready. We'll ram it straight into their path. His voice cracked only once, when he whispered to himself, Sorry, old girl, thinking of the skiff he had built with his own hands. The skiff shot from the tunnel like a spear, its stripped frame shuddering as it accelerated. Mar's remote console vibrated under his hands, his breath coming ragged as he guided it into the teeth of the incoming wave. Hold steady, he muttered, sweat dripping into his mouth. Hold! The display flared white as the skiff collided with the missiles, the detonation painting the screen in violent brilliance. The roar reverberated through the chamber, shaking men against consoles. When the light faded, the missile wave was gone. Mar sagged against the console, his chest heaving, tears streaking down soot-stained cheeks. Resolute seized the moment. Her exhaust flared, the ship modulating in strange pulses that split across the enemy sensors. Red arcs fractured as the Varkal hesitated, interpreting phantom reinforcements surging behind the lone warship. That hesitation was all it took. Reese's voice was hoarse as he shouted, She's firing on the command hull! The display erupted in a bloom of blue, rail slugs tearing through the enemy flagship's core. The warhull convulsed on the screen, its orbit shattering as flames burst from ruptured chambers. The chamber filled with shouts, men pounding rails and consoles, voices breaking in triumph. Hale's voice cut through them, quiet but steady, anchoring them all. It isn't over until they break away. His eyes stayed locked on the display as the flagship split apart, fragments spiraling into the black. One by one, the remaining escorts veered off, retreating into the darkness. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged breaths of men too stunned to cheer again. Mar slid to the floor beside his console, hands trembling, his face streaked with grime and tears. Reese slumped over the rail, gasping, sweat pouring from him like he'd run a marathon in stone boots. Kor wiped his eyes, staring at the scanner still pulsing with the warship's transponder. Hale stood at the center, shoulders squared, despite the blood seeping through his uniform. His voice was quiet but unyielding. The corridor held. The howl carried, and we are still here. The men listened, their exhaustion momentarily suspended by the gravity of his words. The war was not finished, but the impossible had been forced into reality. In that battered chamber, amid dust, smoke, and the taste of grit on their tongues, they had bought survival. Status of the shelters. Hale's demand ripped through the chamber as the last echoes of gunfire faded from the upper levels. His voice carried the gravel of exhaustion, yet it pressed the room into silence. Operators, their faces pale and streaked with sweat, bent over consoles with trembling hands. One by one, responses came. Scattered reports of structural damage, broken air pumps, and wounded evacuees. But the basalt caverns still held. No family had been buried alive under the strikes meant to break them. Reese slumped in his chair, shoulders sagging. His voice cracked with relief. "They lived, sir. We held them off long enough." The man covered his face with his palms, his chest heaving with the kind of release that came only after weeks of terror. Hale watched him with quiet understanding before turning toward Core, who still clutched his portable scanner. Its screen pulsed faintly, confirming the warship remained above. Core's words stumbled out in disbelief. "Resolute is holding orbit. Damage heavy, but she's alive. Commander Knox is signaling he'll maintain cover until we stabilize." He looked up, his lips trembling, as if afraid to believe his own voice. "They didn't abandon us." Mar pushed himself upright from where he'd sat slumped against the console, his eyes red and wet. His hands were still blackened with grease, knuckles bleeding from work and strain. "We lost the last skiff," he muttered, staring at the deck where dust clung to his boots. "But it bought the shield that saved them." He swallowed hard, then straightened, defiance flickering again. "Worth every scrap." Hale approached, laying a hand on Mar's shoulder. "Your crews gave us the sky when no one else could. The colony stands because of them. Their names will be remembered." The words were quiet, yet they cut deeper than any cheer could. Mar nodded once, blinking back the weight of grief. The bunker smelled of scorched wires and sweat-soaked fabric, air heavy with grit shaken loose from every tremor. Men moved slower now, their adrenaline drained, but none abandoned their posts. Hale studied them, their drawn faces, their cracked hands, their hollow stares, and saw men who had crossed the line between laborers and soldiers. They would never return to the men they had been before this siege. Reese cleared his throat, his voice rough. "What happens now?" "They'll come again. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but the Varkle won't forget." His eyes shifted toward the cracked ceiling, as if he could still hear the wreckage tumbling in orbit. "We've shown them weakness in their doctrine. They'll want to erase that lesson." Hale's gaze lingered on the debris scattered across the tactical map, the remnants of drones and escorts still drifting like scar tissue above their world. His tone was steady when he answered. "That's the point, Reese. They thought we would kneel. Instead, we made them retreat. They'll remember that. So will every colony they try to break. Today we proved survival isn't decided by their firepower. It's decided by what we're willing to turn into weapons." Core leaned on the table, exhaustion plain in his posture. "Do you think Fleet will send more? Reinforcements?" Hale's lips curved into something that might once have been a smile, though weariness stripped it bare. "After this, they'll have to." A howl that loud carries farther than any transmission. The chamber fell quiet again, not from despair, but from the sheer weight of what they had endured. Men listened to the groan of the air ducts, the hiss of coolant leaking from ruptured pipes, the distant echo of families emerging from the shelters. Their ears rang with silence where bombardments had dominated for days. The absence of strikes felt almost unreal, as though their bodies did not trust it yet. Mar finally broke the stillness, his voice low but firm. "I'll take crews topside. Clear wreckage, recover what we can. If Fleet wants a report, we'll give them proof the howl was real." His words carried both grief and pride, a man determined to honor the dead by ensuring their sacrifice was seen. Hale nodded. "Do it. Collect fragments, logs, anything that shows how they faltered. Every shard tells the story better than words." He turned to Reese and Core. "You two, draft records of the battle while it's fresh. Numbers matter. Doctrine will change when the truth is undeniable." Core ran a hand over his face. leaving a streak of grime. You really think doctrine shifts because of miners with scrap ships? Hale's stare hardened. It shifts because miners with scrap ships forced a fleet to run. That's history now. Don't diminish it. The men fell into silence once more, each wrestling with the enormity of what had been bought. The chamber echoed only with the scrape of boots and the faint hiss of cracked vents. Hours later, as emergency lights dimmed and the first evacuees were guided from the tunnels, Hale stood on the battered surface. The night sky was alive with drifting wreckage. Broken drones tumbled in lazy arcs. Shattered escorts glimmered faintly where sunlight caught them, and the gutted carcass of the Varkal flagship still bled fragments into orbit. Above it all, the warship Resolute glowed with wounded defiance, radiators flaring weakly as she held her vigil. Mars stood beside him, shoulders squared though his body swayed from exhaustion. "She'll need weeks in dock," he said quietly, nodding toward the warship, but the crew stayed. That counts for something. Hale's voice was low, carrying against the cold night wind. They came howling from the void. That howl saved us, and now every frontier world will know the sound of it. He looked toward the distant shelters where families emerged, eyes wide with disbelief that they were still breathing. Children clung to fathers, miners held one another, faces streaked with tears and dust. The colony was wounded, scarred, but unbroken. Hale turned back to the wreckage above, his chest aching, not just from injury but from the weight of what lay ahead. The enemy thought aid would never come. They thought isolation was enough to crush us. Instead, one ship and one colony rewrote the cost of their war. That's what they'll carry home in their reports. He exhaled slowly, tasting grit in the air, and his voice settled into a vow. They'll never look at humanity the same way again. The wind tugged at his torn uniform, carrying the faint sounds of hammers striking metal as crews began recovery work. Behind him, Mar moved back toward the yard, already shouting for torches and cranes. Reese guided men toward makeshift command posts, his voice steadier now. Core cradled his scanner, recording every flicker from above, as though etching the moment into stone. Hale remained where he stood, staring at the wounded warship above. He let the silence linger, his breath steady, his eyes unblinking. For the first time since the siege began, the horizon did not feel like a wall closing in, but like a door that had been forced open with blood and fire. The howl of Talaris 3 would not fade. It would echo across colonies, across fleets, across councils who had doubted what humanity could endure and what it could unleash when cornered. And in that scarred night sky, lit by wreckage and the faint defiant glow of Resolute, the truth stood clear. They had survived not through miracles, but through will, sacrifice, and deception sharpened into strategy. The howl was humanity's answer, and it had carried farther than the enemy ever imagined. If this story made you feel the weight of humanity's defiance, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY tales. Now we want to hear from you. If you commanded the Resolute on that run through the void, what tactic would you have used to break the enemy fleet? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where humanity howls loud enough to shake the stars. See you in the next story.